My name is Tracy Ajamine, and I am the programs manager at Equally Ours, and that's basically a pan-equality membership-led organization, which Runnymede Trust is also a member of. As part of my role, I actually manage the secretariat for the Funders for Race Equality Alliance. So the Alliance is a group of funders basically who are working together to achieve race equality in the UK. Members include Bristol Foundry Foundation, Esme Fairburn, Paul Hamlin Foundation, City Broad Trust, as well as Luton and Bedfordshire Community Foundation. So different types of foundations operating at different levels. The origin, just to quickly go through that, it started out with a call from the National Lottery Community Fund, which led to a loose alliance of funders coming together because they had the shared concern of racial inequality following Brexit, the rise of hate crime, for example. So it was around the late 2015. The common thread was the concern that the stark of inequalities for Black and brown people were getting even worse. So I came in the Alliance 2 years in, and together we identified three key priorities. And these are increasing funders' focus on race equality, seeking more and better funding with a key focus on Black and minority ethnic led organizations, and improving meaningful racial representation in the funding sector. In this meeting, I've also attached the PowerPoint presentation. So if you can have that all in front of you, and I can talk through it as well. So how we came about with this analysis. So looking at slide 2, in April 2020, the Alliance had a meeting with the BAME Initiative to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on Black and brown people and also the sector. And it was quite early on, actually. And Ubele had produced a series of surveys and research which helped funders build a bigger picture of the growing concerns of the disparities and the impact of COVID-19 on certain communities. And then we also spoke to different sector organizations and networks. And funders were having conversations within the Alliance, conversations about the challenges, the opportunities, and ways that they could build a race equality lens into their funding stream. And we were talking to Ubele and Future Foundations UK, which are a network of Black funders, who were also at that time interested in finding out about the changing landscape of the funding. So together we wanted to better understand the amount, the nature of the emergency funding that came about as a result of Black Lives Matter and COVID-19. And the reason why as well is because there was a wave of funding for organizations which were never seen before. And we wanted to capture that to see, and also if we could compare with other sector organizations. So on to slide 3. A lot of funding, as I previously mentioned, was being released like never before. And this was a shift in funding, which was quite overwhelming when we spoke to organizations. They've never seen that before. And that was we have to also put in context that those VCS groups, for example, entered the pandemic under-resourced and underfunded. So keeping that in mind, the Alliance really wanted to commission analysis to help funds identify what their next step should be, looking at post-COVID recovery, and also beyond that, looking at Brexit, and reviewing and analysing their processes, so finding out what worked and what didn't. Enable more focused conversations on racial justice when looking at future funding strategies. Identifying the key groups which help getting money out there, and networks as well. Identifying the gaps in funding, so looking at what was funding the most and what was funding the least. and how the sector came about to supporting the sustainability of the sector. And lastly, is understanding the causes, consequences, and impact of this unexpected shift in funding for race equality. The overall aim of this report was it was for a funding audience, but also for race equality organisations to understand, have a bigger picture of what was happening. But it was to make funders understand that the funding sector should not and cannot be a reactive sector. We shouldn't treat it as such. And that the much needed support for the race equality sector should not be temporary, and it has to be permanent and sustainable. So looking at to slide 4, the report covered 34 funds. It analysed the type, the amount and purpose of funding awarded to the sector through different funding pots between March 2020 and November 2020. So so we call it basically a snapshot of funds rather than actual individual grants. So this allowed us to have a more in-depth analysis into what the aims were, what the purpose was, and the criteria. It sought views as well from funders themselves who actually put the funding out there, because we wanted to know what had they learned, any reflections, and what their next steps. Because as I said before, we were looking at how to make sure that this is not just a one-off wave of funding for the sector. So slide 5. So the largest amount given to a Black and minority ethnic organisation from a single fund was over 19 million, and that came from London Community Response Fund. The fund actually was the first fund in this analysis to open in March 2020, whilst the other funding pots were available towards the middle or latter part of the year. The longest period of time in which grants had to be spent was 5 years, so not a lot of time actually. But it's really important to state that a high amount had to be spent before at the end of March 2021, which was last month. So it had to be spent within 6 to 12 months when they were made available. So this was one of our key concerns that we actually push in this report, is that because it raises questions about the future of the funding for race equality beyond the short-term funding that happened last year. And we do ask funders in this about what their commitment is towards addressing the impacts of COVID-19 and their commitment to longer term sustainability for the sector. Moving on to slide 6. Another thing that we found is all funds in this analysis were either restricted to England or were available to all 4 nations, with the exception that one fund was allocated to England and Wales. It's also important to state that none of the funds were targeted solely for Scotland or Northern Ireland, although some individual funds were. We mapped out the distribution of funding by English region and devolved nation, where data was available, because that was one of our restraints here, because we were doing a snapshot and we produced this report in about 2 months. So there was some restraints here. But the majority of the funding, 66%, went to London, followed by North West, which received 9%, and then Yorkshire and the Humber, and then West Midlands, which received about 5% each. 2% went to Scotland, 1.6% to Wales, and Northern Ireland received at least 1%. Evidently, there is a regional disparity, but some of the reasons for these disparities are quite complex, and we can't just give a simple reason for that. I mean, for example, we know that many organisations, although they reside outside of London, also have key clients, organisations that they work with within London. So they have a reach which touches London. So the information is quite skewed. And I think what we look forward to doing next steps for the Alliance is understanding the number, size, and type of organisations of London-based organisations, and then comparing that to other regions. I think this would help funders understand if the dissemination of their funding, including emergency funding, was proportionate to the number of organisations in each region. As well as it has to also look at the minority ethnic population as well within each region. Slide 7. So how grants could be spent was divided into three categories: restricted, unrestricted, and flexible. So restricted funds could only be spent on specific priorities and had restrictions on use. 7.36 million of the funding analysed had restrictions, and that made up 16% of the total funding and covered 14 funds out of the 34. Unrestricted funding provided core funds and it had no restrictions. These funds, for example, could be used on core costs, including salaries and rent and operations, for example. That was 14.5 million of the funding came from that category, so 31% in total. And then there's also the flexible funds category, which basically took both restricted funds and unrestricted funding. So the majority of the funding actually came from that category, so 25.36 million. And that was 53.6% of the total funding, and that referred to 9 funds. The dominance of flexible funds we were really happy to see, and it illustrated that funders were being responsive and were listening to the sector, having spoken to them as well. And we make in the report good reference points to, for example, Smallwood Trust, the Lotteries Phoenix Fund, Power to Change, Comic Relief, and Lloyds Bank Foundation, as well as Black Funding Network, who were listening to the sector and were flexible in their funding strategy. Slide 8. As part of the analysis, funders were asked to also talk about the type of projects they actually were funding. Most popular was adaptation, poverty, health, and gender. And those were the most popular things to fund amongst the funds that we analyze. So these covered, for example, food banks, support for people with no resources, or to public funds, mental health, violence against women, and also funding organizations with adapting to basically post COVID. So looking at how do we change our work culture. We only found that only 9 funds covered human rights and social justice and racial justice. And we talk about that there is a need to have a longer term, a longer lens in investing racial justice work and advocating for racial justice as well. And this couldn't be any more timely, I think, given what's happening with the race report and the denial of systemic racism. Slide 9. So funders actually also broadened their funding priority. So for example, if a funder was only funding, gender, some of them actually moved beyond and look at how it intersected with disability, for example, and they funded such issues. Comic Relief was an example of that. Moving on to slide 10. So to provide a context, sometimes I can't see the slides. I can put it in the group chat. Give me 1 second. That's okay, you're not interrupting, it's fine. There we go. Should be on everyone's group chat now. Okay, so we're on slide 10. So to provide context and a deeper understanding of the is that okay? Yeah, so to provide a context on a deeper understanding of the decisions that funders made during this period, we actually spoke to some of them. And what came out was that funders understood the importance of the sector and the work that they were doing. They wanted to take a longer term approach to racial justice. And they now understand from speaking to 7 funders that this work cannot be done without the sector. So there's the need of cross-sector collaborations. So examples that funders came out with was, one of them is actually co-producing a funding program with two security organizations. And one is actually also devolving their power to local communities. So we've seen some concrete examples to come out of this. Onto slide 11. So as funders move into the next phase of the pandemic, our first recommendation is that they need to keep up with the momentum and apply what they've learned across the year and not go back to business as usual. We do say that funders have a role in redressing the underinvestment, the historical underinvestment of the sector, and they need to create also generational funding opportunities to advance greater racial justice in the UK. So going back to our first recommendation, we asked funders to apply long-term lens at these issues, that it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be reacting to the sector through reactive work. So we have asked them to look at existing and future funding to apply a racial justice lens. So that's one of our key recommendations. So we basically also identified what funding strategies worked. We looked at ring fencing, which was actually addressed by Charity So White in the paper to Comic Relief. So we recommend about ring fencing. We look at also at re-granting through intermediary organizations. Examples were INCON and Voice for Change, for example. We say that this definitely works. We also look at participatory grant making, which was done through the Phoenix Fund. And we also recommend that funders take that approach. So what Phoenix Fund did actually was actually act as, so the lottery acted as facilitators rather than they weren't part of the product, but they provided the space and the thinking around it and enabled community leaders to play a big part in identifying the funding and distributing the funding. And that actually had a big impact as well, as I think it was like 20% of the applicants had never heard of the lottery before. So it showed that it does work. So we provided them with examples as prioritization, additional pre-application support, like webinars, for example, was really helpful, and direct referrals. It's just to say that basically when approaching the sector, it can't just be a mainstream approach, it has to be specifically targeted. We also say in this report that these issues are more internal than external, and that funders need to actually do the work themselves to acknowledge and get in touch with and build relationships with organizations that are already doing the work. So this is something that we believe that funders can do themselves. And it's not at the fault of anyone, but not to say that basically not another report, that's the kind of thing we'll kind of say. I know that the funder, the sector is tired of being asked for data and stories. So we also say in this piece that funders have to actively raise their own awareness of the sector. We are actually, we've commissioned a mapping report of the sector, because the last one that was created was by Voice for Change in 2007. So we want to build on that and find out basically who are the key players and what are the issues they're working on, and has there been any improvement. What makes this report a bit different is that we are doing it during COVID, where we know that a lot of organizations are struggling. Some of them have had to even close down. So we are basically capturing a current picture of what it looks like, so that funders have no excuse to say we don't know who works on what, basically. And that report will be out towards the end of this month. So another thing that we're also recommending is for funders to complete our racial justice funding audit. So one of our priorities is to create more and better funding for the sector. And we need to in order to do that, we need to understand how much money is actually going into the sector. So we've created a funding audit, which takes a sample of any foundation's funding profile and they find out from this how much of their money is going to a Black and brown led organization, how much is going towards the root causes of racism or the consequences of racism. It's looking at how much of this is core and how much of it is project based. It's also looking at the issues, how much of it's going to services, campaign or research, for example. And we've done that basically to let funders know where the money is going and where it should be going. And from that funding audit, actually, for example, Trust for London are changing with their funding. Lloyds Bank Foundation also, they've actually started finding out at what stage do most Black and brown organizations drop off in the application process. So a lot of funds are actually learning a lot through this funding racial justice audit, because it's finding out basically where they are going wrong and what they need to do to get it right, basically. So we had interviews with funders, and just to say, for example, that yes, we asked for key examples of what change they've made. So one funder said that they had already ring-fenced 30% of their funds to the sector in light of Black Lives Matter movement. Another funder has relaunched their non-emergency funding streams and have revised their priorities to ensure that their funds are targeting the sector. And then I also remember one funder actually is actually looking at their existing funding priorities and completely changing that, making sure that it has a racial justice lens. So we've captured some good examples that we share in the report, and we basically ask funders to learn from what's gone well and make it their own and apply it to the sector with the sector. Most importantly, in this report, we say to funders that their role is not to rescue organizations, but it's more of an internal work, that they have to look at their funding profile. They have to look at who decides on what gets funded, for example. They have to look at their own power dynamic and their own privilege and listen, but also with that listening comes actions as well. And that has to be with the sector. Thank you. Now I'll take any questions. Yeah, I put the copy of the report in my presentation, but I will find it and put it in the chat now. Has anybody got any questions at all? No, I guess I have questions for you, maybe in terms of oh yes, Maxine.
Yeah, there was one that I posted. I think you've answered it. You know, you've mentioned two of the major funders. So, you know, we know that there's about 12 of the major funders that give around 60% to the sector in terms of funding. And so I'm just trying to understand how widespread is the sort of acknowledgement and engagement with a much broader group of funders. So, you know, are those, you know, those smaller family institutions, trusts and foundations, are they entering into this space? So I almost feel we are preaching to some of the converted already. And also, you know, I think you made the point that it is also part of their work to engage and to raise awareness about organisations in this space as well.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So initially our ethos was we welcome anybody with a funder that has an interest in racial inequality and want to fix that. But we're now moving towards looking at what does a racial justice funder look like. And in racial justice funding, just having an interest isn't good enough, basically. Right. So we are also we are revising our membership to find out, basically making sure that all the funders on board are understanding that this is going to require more than just an interest. So we're also, just to be open, like we're struggling to understand from this perspective that it's hard, but at the same time understand that we're also working for the sector to get to a place where it's permanent and sustainable. And just being what's the word is, just being nice is not good enough, basically. So but that means do we leave behind some organizations, some foundations who are not there yet? So we are having that internal battle currently as an alliance, but at the moment we say, as a starting point, at least know what you're funding, and that is having the racial justice audit. So we're going to actually release the results of the first cohort. 13 foundations actually completed it, and they vary. Some of them are community foundations, some of them are bigger foundations as well, but some of them are in the middle. So and with that, we ask them what have they done following that audit. So we always say, like, when you're being part of this alliance, it has to come with change. And so, for example, we've had internal conversation about what is racial equality, what is racial equity, and what is racial justice. And so like I said, like, we're doing more internal work than external work at the moment, because we know that we can't come to the sector saying that we're ready when we're not, basically. So it takes a bit of both. Have I answered that question for you?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. Very insightful. Thank you.
Miss Mukami, you've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask a question about Scotland. You said something about your work included Scotland, and I kind of missed what you said, because some of the challenges we have are that big funders tend to distribute funds in Scotland through subsidiaries or agencies, and which you'll find small African women, particularly led organizations, are not even on the radar of funders. And I just wanted to know what you found out in Scotland.
Very good question. And I can say this very honestly, we didn't find a lot. Like, looking at the funding priorities, Scotland wasn't a big part of their priorities, which is what we said actually in this report, that there needs to be a bigger mapping looking at the different organizations. I know that some work is happening in Scotland, so we don't want to duplicate, but actually work with. So the main thing, like I said, like, it was mostly England and Wales. Some of the funding went to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but they were an acute minority in that.
Right, okay, thank you. We'll keep trying.
No, and please, so also my role as part of managing secretariat is also to increase understanding of what's going on. So I'll leave my email in the group chat, and what we do is we also raise their awareness of what's going on in the sector. So if you have anything exciting, please send it my way, and I will also share it with the funders themselves. So one thing is, like, we want to find out what's going on, and if I can broker that knowledge, please let me know, basically. Yeah, so I'll put my email in the chat box.